I just would like to ask your permission to report with you, Hala Murad, from the Bean Association for Development, Environmental Development. At the Bean, we are members at Habitat International Coalition. For 5 years now, we have been working together towards linking habitat issues with environmental rights and climate justice. I'm very happy being part of this meeting. With us also the facilitators from a number of regions, Arab countries and international countries. We have 6 facilitators. And also, in addition to the learning officers, Diana, who is the learning officer, as well as Areli from Latin America. And with us also are a number of dear people. We are very happy to be with you today. We had previous sessions. We can summarize as a first session on the 5th of October that spoke basically on concepts having to do with climate justice and concepts having to do with climate change. I can say that in the second session we covered issues relating to rights and issues about how we see climate justice from the angle of human rights from the different regions. We were joined by, for example, from Europe, 7% participants, and from the Middle East also, we had 15% of the participants, and the lion's share came from Latin America at a percentage of about 50% of the participants from Latin America. I can say that the previous session, the second session that covered justice and human rights and legal perspective for climate justice, where, as you see on the screen now, I hope we can move to the speakers for the second session. With us, we were joined by David Williams and Eric Wakwei Cho, Kelly Komatsu, Dr. Ngono Ngamari, the ones who covered specialized issues related to how we can view this human rights perspective with relation to climate change and climate justice. Dear participants, this third session, we will cover mainly the other approaches. We will talk about differences and struggles that people experience. As you see today, we have experiences from the ground, live and real experiences that could put the basis for the important session having to do with how we can perceive our changes, our similarities, and our struggles, how we can work on the ground, what are the measures, solutions, and policies, the community policies that we work usually with civil society organizations. There is also a particular session about the main approaches we used to cover, addressing or dealing with civil society and its struggles, and how we can work on the different sectors through the region, through the one region, and through the different regions. Now, I welcome you once again. I'm very happy to be among you, to meet the friends from different regions and different spaces who work on climate change and towards achieving climate justice. I give the ground to my friend from the facilitator team, Frank. I give you the floor to start with this session. I am very happy that we will be working together. شكرا.
Thank you very much, Hala. Good evening to everyone. Good evening to our presenters, the team, and the main players in climate justice. I would like, with your permission, to start to present to you the answers that we got from the different participants.
Contre le changement climatique. Deuxièmement, quelles sont les
The
stratégies
first question, any real strategies of climate change struggles? Number two, what are the strategies you have used to advocate for climate justice? Third, what are the challenges you've encountered in your advocacy for climate justice? And the fourth question is, are there any local songs about regions, about water, climate, and nature in your region, which are used to mobilize people to act? These four asynchronous questions were the ones that enabled us to obtain some answers. And we received responses from Tunisia. There's a Agenda Climate Finance Project, which is an integrated agenda integration project that aims to fight climate change, and women are climate activists in the country with the objective of addressing climate justice and enhancing climate financing for the benefit of local actors working on projects supporting rural women as the final beneficiaries. The action is advocacy efforts at both the local and national levels, collaborating with the stakeholders and other decision makers with the goal of ensuring that the gender perspective is consistently considered in all financing initiatives on climate change at national level to make a more inclusive and participatory approach to women in this essential program. The second slide, Diana.
Alors, la deuxième diapo.
The second slide here is still within the FENA Klima Agenda and Climate Finance project in Tunisia. Here, we are talking about a multifaceted approach, placing a strong emphasis on the voices and needs of those most affected by climate change, especially rural women. They use local community initiatives to look at challenges, lessons learned, experience sharing, also to promote local solutions that are context specific, putting in place training, as well as promoting local solutions that are context specific, all while carrying out advocacy at national level with other political decision makers and policy makers, as well as government institutions. Third slide, please, Diana. Next. Go back. Next slide a bit. On this slide, on this slide, we speak about including gender in the fight against climate change and women as climate activists, as well as solutions proposed by the youth and climate justice issues, as well as enhancing the fight against climate change by conducting local awareness activities to ensure that gender is systematically taken into account in climate change financing initiatives. Sorry, Frank has been muted. Someone has muted Frank.
Frank, you're muted. اوكي.
فرانك إذا كنت تسمعني فصوتك مغلق.
Oui.
Frank, if you hear me, your voice is muted.
Alors, je disais, j'ai présenté les questions.
As I said, I presented the asynchronous issues and I presented the FENACLIMA project in Tunisia. And with the 3 slides, I spoke about some of the approaches that were used in Tunisia.
Voilà. Maintenant, est-ce
Right
que
now, maybe I can give the floor to the person taking over the next phase. It's time to present the first speaker, if I may be allowed.
est-ce que je peux inviter
Frank, yes, please go ahead and introduce our
Okay.
first speaker,
Alors,
Emmanuel.
OK, notre premier intervenant s'appelle Emmanuel.
Our first speaker is called Emmanuel Osuteye. He's an environmental, social, and legal researcher who's passionate on sustainable development in developing countries, specifically in the African continent. He has a multidisciplinary training in both natural and social sciences and works within the context of environmental policy and regulation, resource management, climate change adaptation, and related social issues. Emmanuel has huge research on several African countries such as Sierra Leone, Ghana, Benin, Nigeria, Kenya, Malawi, Uganda, Tanzania, and the Gambia, and regularly provides technical inputs to sustainable development policy formulation and implementation process. Dr. Emmanuel will speak about the identification of solutions, measures, policies, and strategies by communities, civil society organizations, and governments. Dr. Emmanuel, you will have 15 minutes to make your presentation. And without further ado, Dr. Emmanuel, over to you if you can hear us.
Thank you very much. And I hope you can hear me. I will continue in English. And thank you for the opportunity to share with the group the third installment of the co-learning space, moving a little bit more from policy and the conceptual basis into more practice-oriented conversations. This is quite a very broad topic. So looking at climate justice struggles and strategies across contexts and regions, and identifying solutions, measures, policies, and strategies by communities, civil society organizations, and governments. So very, very, very broad remit. And I hope that in the time that we have, in 15 minutes, I can only give you a flavor that will open up the conversation and expand the ideas that actually we need to do something about this climate crisis, and we need to do something about it because it is a matter of justice. So the question, as a recap, if you like, of why we need to address climate justice. And the reason is that climate change is widespread and cross-cutting. It's not an environmental crisis. It's not an environmental issue. Because there are significant social and political concerns, we need to address climate justice. Because of the disproportionate burdens, and I think that you've talked about it in the last 2 sessions, and it's because people are affected differently. The people that have the fewest resources, have contributed the least, are being affected the most, and so we need to talk about it. We need to look at climate justice because all justice concerns begin to get connected. The interconnectedness of the struggle doesn't just yield benefits for the environment, but it yields benefits for fairer society, equitable living, so on and so forth. And we also need to think about the fact that there are differentiated responsibilities. And so climate justice is not just about finding blame, but the fact that people and different actors have different capacities and different roles to play, both historically and at present. And we also think about agency and not victimhood, that actually the burdens, the disproportionate burdens, the people that are bearing the burdens also have a part to play and can do something about it themselves. So the next slide, if we're looking at this very broad plethora of who is able to do something, identifying solutions and policies and practices, etc., I think that
we can cascade it right from the international and governmental level through to the non-governmental and NGOs and CBOs, all the way down to the communities. And I think that's how we can have this conversation this afternoon. Again, like I said, this is just to give you a flavor. If we identify that at the international and the intergovernmental level, one of the biggest elephants in the room in dealing with issues of, solving climate change and addressing the critical imbalance and finding really justice in this story is that we need to really talk about money again. And we need to begin to think about new approaches and investments and finances that reach the most vulnerable and communities. And so how do we enable money to trickle down to the least? I've just been in a meeting with people in the ECOWAS who are talking about the spillage of a dam, water from a dam in Ghana, and it's now moving into Togo, crossing the boundary, and about 15,000 people have been affected. And how do we ensure that the $1 million that is going to be disbursed in the next couple of weeks actually gets to the communities that have been affected? That's a huge question, and we need to think about measures and solutions to that. We need to think about eliminating unjust barriers. Again, if you look at the elephant in the room with regards to money, then it needs to be transparent and accessible, mechanisms to ensure that people and countries and places like many countries in the global south are able to access some of these funds. If you ever work with anyone that is dealing with climate action and adaptation planning and adaptation action, they will tell you that it is a nightmare to even fill the forms and get accreditation and understand how to go around it. And we need to think about it. Eliminating all kinds of unjust barriers need to be done. There is an emphasis on capacity building, and all kinds of capacities and capabilities need to be built in order to be able to allow the most vulnerable countries be able to kind of step up in their efforts. We also need innovation. We use the word innovation quite loosely and quite a lot. But I think that at the international level, a lot of the discussions and the debates really need to hone in on what does innovation actually mean, and how does innovation support resilience building, and how does innovation reach the lowest level and the lowest skills? Because climate justice really will only be achieved if the most vulnerable and the most affected are involved and engaged in any work or any climate activity and action. The next slide. I think that therefore, to give you some examples, just to enhance the flavor, that if we are to identify these solutions and measures and strategies at the international level, we can give an example of what we call the nationally determined contributions, and to think of the nationally determined contributions as pathways to achieving climate justice. Actually, the NDCs, the ways in which all countries are now communicating what they are doing about climate change, need to factor in the disproportionate burden that the poorest and the vulnerable are having, so that the NDC is not just an accounting of how we are reducing carbon, but when calling what a decarbonization is a proxy for empowerment. And so actually, we can empower local communities, we can empower the vulnerable through the NDC process. It's a way in which we can tie in all the other national priorities, adaptation plans, local plans, etc., can tie in, and countries must take this opportunity to communicate how their people in particular areas are struggling, are affected the West, and how we can bring support to them. It's a very fantastic opportunity to be very targeted about support to the most vulnerable. At the last COP, we heard about the loss and damage fund, and I think this is a new modality. Again, identifying new modalities that are beginning to emerge, which go beyond adaptation and mitigation, but begins to also galvanize this targeted negotiation approach. So across Africa, across the global South, there will be groups and clusters of negotiators, and they will be able to amplify the voice of the most vulnerable and to bring action there. Again, innovative solutions, I give an example. Across Africa, there are now early warning systems that are beginning to be able to flag when there's going to be the hazards that hit and affect the poorest the most, so that early warning can go with some kind of early action, and so that vulnerabilities are reduced because of limited exposure when people are aware, so that rains and floods will come, but they don't take people by surprise. And that's a very important thing. The next slide. I think that if you look at another layer of CSOs and NGOs, one of the ways in which they identify solutions and measures and strategies is that you can see that NGOs and CSOs are very critical in setting, raising, and sustaining agenda. I don't think that there would have been a climate justice agenda as it is now without the critical role that NGOs and CSOs have played. And they've lifted the agenda right from the grassroots all the way to the international level. If you look at the COPs, the most recent COP27 in 2022 in Egypt, there were 3,178 accredited NGOs and community-based organizations, civil society organizations present. It just shows you the growth in the scope, in the recognition, and in the agenda setting potential. And that's a very important thing. We need to see CSOs as policy catalysts and how they bring, a way in which they actually help shift and shape policies relating to climate change and climate action. They also play a very important accountability function, holding governments to account actually on their commitments and helping them to stick to what they say they will do and flagging gaps and ensuring that national policy making does not forget the poor and the vulnerable. Very, very important. Often top-down national government policy making ignores and makes the poor and vulnerable blind. And we often claim that the poor are neglected and they are not accounted for, but it's because of the failure of their own governments. We can't blame international organizations and the UN when national governments have not accounted for their own people. And NGOs and CSOs are critical in galvanizing coalitions and amplified actions. I think HIC is a coalition. HIC is an umbrella body. And so this is a very important example to make, that actually the growing networks for climate action shows that that's the way to go. It's not just one organization or one voice at a time. Next, on communities, I think that the ways in which solutions are emerging that really target the heart of the problem and bring solutions to climate justice is that communities themselves flag the justice and equity imperatives. You see, if you sit at the UN or you sit in a very nice big boardroom and talk about climate change and the need for adaptation and mitigation without bringing the lens to the communities, sometimes the issues aren't brought to bear. When I did policy work at various levels, but until I started going to the field as a postdoc or as a researcher, then you then begin to appreciate the gravity of the issue. Communities bring the justice and equity imperatives to climate responses themselves. They highlight the burdens and show almost like a witness-bearing approach to the needs for climate action. Communities help mobilize agency. Actually, significant labor and significant efforts at dealing with climate change and climate action in communities is volunteer, it's free. And if you look at clusters and groups like the SDI and various community-based organizations for climate action, it's because of mobilized agency. And this is a very important thing that we need to recognize in identifying any solution or developing any measure, that agency exists within communities. And also that resilience practices can be done at the lower scale in communities: tree planting, bank stabilization, waste management, so on and so forth. And also the fact that communities themselves act as first responders when it comes to the impacts of climate change and climate action. There aren't elaborate first responder, structures. There aren't elaborate structures in many, many countries. It is the communities that do it themselves. There is also a growth in the recognition, as far as solutions are concerned, is that the potential for co-production and collaborative efforts and working with communities themselves to meet the equity and justice goals cannot be overlooked. Actually, I would argue that it's a huge gap if communities and the people involved and affected and various actors do not work together to meet these equity goals. How do we meet equity and justice goals without working with communities? I think that will be an elusive target. This expands this notion of inclusive governance, and we need to recognize that as well. I think that communities also bring pathways for epistemic justice. We talk about the way in which people's knowledge can be recognized and applied, and that's implicit. I flag here in conclusion, as far as identifying solutions are concerned, is the post-COVID opportunity. I think that COVID came, of course, to show how much communities were impacted and affected, but it leaves us with that lingering lesson that actually the injustices that communities are living with, and the most vulnerable and people at the bottom are facing, hasn't gone away. And actually, the lessons of COVID can actually reinvigorate the climate justice campaign, and should reinvigorate. A lot of the communities, organizations that were active in COVID were actually climate and environmental based groups, and we need to kind of re-emerge and reconnect with that. I'll show you a few examples as we wrap up this elaboration. I think that these are projects that I've been connected to, and some of you may be aware of them, and I leave them in the slide for you to think about them, because these give us a plethora of examples of how actually local action, so the one on the right, ordinary actions, innovation at the local scale will fill policy and practice gaps, and a lot of examples happening across the world. The one on the left will show you how there's an emphasis on co-production and epistemic justice and local knowledge and enhanced capacities to deal with injustices in general, particularly in urban areas, and that would also help you to identify examples. One clear example I'd like to show is multi-level governance structures, particularly in Freetown, Sierra Leone, that have been developed and will be used to solve all kinds of developmental challenges, but including action against climate change and building adaptation at the lowest levels. And you'll see that if you move to the next slide, it is aggregation of community actors, multi-level actors, multiple groups that come together and are able to influence both city-level processes, but very, very grounded community processes, allow for continuity of action. I think that one of the solutions we need is continuity of action. It's not sporadic, it's not a flash in the pan, it's not one NGO activity and a little project here and there, but continuity of action is critical to sustain and support action at the lowest level. The next slide. Examples of innovation. I think that on the left, you can see that in drought-affected parts of East Africa, there is an emergence, for instance, of solar irrigation, so that actually we are harnessing the sun to irrigate very intensive agriculture practices, and that are drought-resistant strategies to help feed people. We're looking at ways in which waste can be reduced, reused, recycled, repurposed, etc. Waste can become useful inputs, and I think these are some examples of how innovative practices have been happening. The last slide, and then conclusion, is leveraging again on the COVID opportunity. I think that we should look back at COVID as a reflection. People have moved on too quickly, and life is returned to normal too quickly. But I think the lessons of COVID are instructive, particularly for the world's poorest and West affected by climate change, to be able to see how those lessons and how those measures and how those agency and practices can be used to address the climate justice issues. Somebody has called COVID as the inequality virus. That was the middle name, and another acronym for COVID was the inequality virus. We need to bring back the conversations and the lessons. So to end, we need to address climate justice, and we need to think about the various roles and responsibilities of different actors. We've seen that across, right from the international level all the way down to communities, everybody has a part to play. There is an intersectionality, and that should be the imperative. It's not just reducing emissions in communities and the most affected, but it's creating a fairer and more just world. This is the overarching banner for why we need to address climate change and make it as an issue for climate justice. It's not just emissions, it's not just an environmental issue, it is a fairer and more just world. And we need to affect and support the agency of the most affected communities. I think this is a big theme for anyone that works on the grassroots, that solutions are best designed, best implemented, and best effected at the lowest level. Let me end there, and I hope this is enough of a flavor of this very big ambition on identifying solutions, measures, policies, and strategies. Thank you.
Voilà. Merci, Dr. Emmanuel.
Thank you, Dr. Emmanuel. Thank you for your brilliant intervention, which was also quite significant. We retain several lessons. One, the issue of climate justice and climate change is an affair for everyone, and especially for the most vulnerable. Thank you, Dr. Emmanuel, and thank you, dear participants. I would like to come back to you to know if you have any questions or reactions following the brilliant presentation made by Dr. Emmanuel Osuteye. So we wait for your questions, your reactions, so that Emmanuel can give you answers or solutions. Then we would also like to know, what are the solutions, what are the measures and the strategies that you implement in your regions and localities? These are some of the concerns that we wait for you. So, dear audience, you have the floor. Frank is muted.
Oui, nous restons à votre écoute.
Well, dear audience, you have the floor. Do you have any questions, concerns to raise following the presentation by Dr. Emmanuel? You have 20 minutes for this Q&A period. Yes, 20 minutes for discussions, Q&A, or even if you want to talk about strategies that you're developing or you're implementing. Yes, I see Laura has raised her hand. Over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Emmanuel, for the very inspiring talk. I wanted to ask you your opinion on something, since you've worked in so many different countries and different places. You talked about the policy catalysts, helping at the policy level, and the co-production or the co-productive approaches and participatory approaches at the ground level. But often in countries that are very autocratic or top down, both of those are not really there. There isn't really an open door for the work at the policy level, and on the ground we also struggle a lot with encouraging collective and participatory approaches for the environment, let alone climate. So I wanted to know if you have any hopeful examples or ideas of different ways that us as civil society organizations or people working in this sector can work at multiple levels without getting exhausted, and having a kind of a pathway at the participatory level and the policy level. So I just thought if you knew of any examples to share. Thank you.
No, thank you for that, Laura. And yes, you're right. I think that in many jurisdictions, it's a luxury to be able to effectively engage. And often community groups and NGOs are placed in an antagonistic, pathway with governments and with authorities, etc. But I think that there is some room for maneuver somehow in these places where there is an opportunity to amplify voices via other means that are not your own. And I think that is where the opportunities sometimes lie, in places where the struggle is there or it's a bit repressive. Partnering and networking always brings an approach where the voice is echoed beyond your government and beyond your space. Often that sometimes gets attention. I think also thinking about different fora and different platforms where the message can be, it always also helps. I think that, like I mentioned with the COP processes, but there are increased access for space, for NGOs to speak and at the international level, and that often gets attention. And I've seen many. If you look at the recent struggles on e-waste, for instance, e-waste menace in West Africa, it was via the route of documentary competitions and NGOs flagging and raising their voice outside the dominant space. It wasn't, for instance, like Ghana, it wasn't the Ghanaian government's ingenuity that brought so much action, but actually was journalists that were doing work with UNEP and Al Jazeera and so on and so forth, that were able to raise that voice and bring some kind of external pressure where it's necessary. And I think that can be done. I think also co-production is a very broad, elaborate process, and we simplify it when we kind of mention it in a bullet in a slide. But I've discovered working with different groups that it needs some ally, and you would be surprised that there almost always is some kind of an ally on the ground and some relationship building. And co-production for me is nothing but relationship building. And if you hit a wall, try again. If you hit a difficult wall, open it again, and let's see. And I think I've seen that happen in for instance, in Freetown, Sierra Leone. It's very, very much celebrated that, you know, the city authorities are working with community groups to a large extent, etc. Threats of evictions have come down, so on and so forth. But 5 years prior to this success of a transformed Freetown agenda was actually the biggest wave of evictions that the city had ever seen as far as informal settlements were concerned. And the relaunching of the campaign of the federations with a new municipal and city leadership was the sort of salvation point, if I may put it that way. So it's difficult to always kind of put an umbrella, you know, tactic. But I think that it's an ongoing struggle of relationship building, of opportunity identification. And I think you have to do this iterative exercise of mapping and scoping opportunities. Who are my allies? Where is there room for maneuver? Where did we meet a roadblock today, but potentially can be an open door tomorrow? And who can we lobby? Where can we find allies? Who can open the doors behind the scenes? You speak to government officials who say, behind the scenes and off the record, we don't like this, we support you. And then you meet them at meetings and then they wear their suit and tie and say, we are against you, because in their official capacity, they have to be against. So you need to find your allies behind the scenes and so on and so forth. I think this is just a flavor of an off-the-cuff response. But yes, it's not simple, it's not easy, it's a lengthy campaign, but keep the struggle going.
Merci, Dr. Emmanuel. Anna Pastor.
Thank you, Dr. Emmanuel. We have other questions. Hillary, you had lifted up your hand. So over to you. Hillary, you can ask your question.
Yes, thank you. Yes, okay. Maha Ahmed. Maha Ahmed. I am working as a senior lawyer and director of
Ahmed.
Rights Program.
So my question is
in the
Sorry.
Commission.
Sorry, Hillary and Maha, we have two people speaking.
Okay.
So we can
okay.
Sorry about that.
I am waiting.
Okay. So let's have Hillary and then Maha.
Okay, Hillary.
And then Anna.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Merci, Dana.
Okay. Thank you so much. So my question was on
Donc ma question
the issue of
generalizing
maybe as the world in terms of mitigating and also adapting to climate change.
Sorry, Hillary. So sorry. Yeah. So I'm so sorry. We can hear the French interpretation, please. So we couldn't get you correctly. Yes. Hillary, you can finally continue. So sorry about these interruptions. Please go ahead.
Okay. So my question was on the issue of having a general approach to the mitigation and adaptation strategy in terms of maybe saying for the global south, maybe particularly maybe for example to say in Africa, maybe only emit maybe about 3% of total global emissions, which means in terms of my question is, do we have to have a general approach to say we have to cut our emissions, or should we as African countries maybe go for a position where we say we also have to emit, because some other developed countries have developed through emitting, or maybe also lobby for technology transfer, cheaper technology transfer, like currently to solar energy and other green technology. So are very expensive maybe when it comes to Africa. But I'm thinking maybe we could have maybe a different global south approach and also a different global north approach in terms of approaching the adaptation and mitigation strategies. Thank you.
Good. No, thank you. I think, I mean, that's an interesting question. And I think that at present, actually, it does happen that there are different, that's why they call them negotiations. And in the past, actually, before 2015, the negotiations were underscored by a principle called common but differentiated responsibilities. So there was a common concern about the global climate, but there were differentiated approaches where developed countries were separated from developing, so-called Annex 1 versus non-Annex 1, so on and so forth. But the consensus after 2015 was that actually everybody needs to do something to reduce emissions. Because as far as climate change is concerned, the point source is that rising emissions is not acceptable, and it would continue to be a huge driver for climate change. The concern, therefore, is that should Africa and the historically those who are least responsible for it be allowed to continue to emit, I think that it comes through in what they call their nationally determined contributions. That's what the NDC means. So every country has its right to tell at that level what it's going to do about climate change. And it's a balance between reductions and development, actually. The NDCs mirror the country's national development plans and national adaptation plans. So they work in concert to show how some amount of development will be necessary, particularly in the global south. The language of a net effect on carbon reduction is significant, and that's a mathematical term. A net effect means that some growth and increase in industry and manufacturing will be abated in other areas, and the cumulative effect will be a reduction. So net zero does not mean touch nothing, but net zero means that it's a balanced, comprehensive approach of development, adaptation, and mitigation, so that the overall effect in relation to the baseline of 1990 is less. So there is room for development for Africa and the developing countries and so on and so forth. And the negotiator groups pick that up. So Africa is represented by something called the AGN, it's the Africa Group of Negotiators before every COP. And they already produce this harmonized approach, which advanced the need for development, advanced the need for technology transfer, advanced the need for et cetera, vis-a-vis the need that we still need to acknowledge that we all have something to do. It's an all hands on deck. It's not just about the net and the actual, aggregate figures of emissions, but it's a principle. I think when you're talking about justice, a lot of this is now moving a bit into the legal side, but underlining justice is ethics and principles. So the principle is that emissions aren't good. And so even though we are least responsible, I think it's a good thing that Africa is on the bandwagon, or developing countries are on the bandwagon, in the principle that emissions must come down. It's the ethic and the principle that also matters, yes.
I think I'll just moderate for now. Okay, Frank is back.
Oui, je suis là.
Yes, I'm here.
Hello.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, Dr. Emmanuel. Voilà.
Donc, nous avons, we will hand over to Maha and then to Anna Pastor.
Maha,
I think Anna Pastor is already.
I am working.
So Maha, kindly.
I am Maha. I am working as senior lawyer and the director of the Economic and the Social Rights Program. In the Egyptian Commission for Rights and Freedoms. I will continue بالعربي. أنا محامية.
I'm a lawyer. at the same time, I'm the director of a program for social rights. At first, sometimes we cannot get to some except through some field surveys and workshops, because security knows about the meetings. Other people, if I know them, I cannot talk about the issue. Whether because there are threats that are being sent to those people. And so if anyone was subject to some harm, especially rural women and in the coastal areas, those women actually are harmed, but they cannot talk. Perhaps there is some injustice. Women do not get educated, for example. Another point, if the issue is to take this to court, even then I cannot continue. So I find that in the second session at court, the whole thing is being rejected and refused. So I don't know what are other alternatives. When we have a disaster with climate change, in the past, let's say that I used to do something, let's say 2-3 years ago, but what is the solution now? Can we file complaints somewhere to the UN, for example? Is there any kind of foreign interference? Can someone help us? And thank you for giving me the floor.
Yeah, I think that's quite a, thank you for sharing, and that's quite a difficult, reality for people that have to go through, threats to life and their well-being in order to fight for what should be, have been guaranteed. I think that these things are contextually significant, and you need to assess from a case-by-case basis on the ground what is feasible and where struggles can be merged, or where allies or where voices can be amplified. The latter part of your question asking whether there are international support, there are, and I think maybe as an offshoot to this conversation, we can kind of suggest where you can speak to, or who you can speak to try and get additional support, from Amnesty International to all sorts of rights-based groups, and whether that can be helpful. I think that at the very heart of things, and this is a different geography where I've worked a lot, often recognizing social structures that are working and are influential and can be lobbied. I'll give you an example. Even in the fight in COVID, when restrictions were put in place, and because of restrictions, people's rights were beginning to be trampled upon because their livelihood was dependent on movement and mobility and so on and so forth. One thing that happened, and this is in Dakar, Senegal, is that religious leaders are very influential and very powerful, and are used to broker that, mediated approach of communication, so that instead of civil protection authorities and local security authorities carrying this harsh and heavy message and clashing with community groups, there is a mediation role that community structures that have some power, some agency. In this context, they were religious, but in that context, they could be traditional, they could be other ways, can be leveraged upon. I think I often come back to the question of what exists and what is working. Even if it's the slightest ember of what is working, often it's a good place to start. Instead of trying to create a space for yourself, ask yourself that what works in society? How are campaigns working? No matter how removed your campaign is from a climate justice campaign, often it may be easier to jump on a structure or a system or a network or a group or an authority or soft power that is working, and leverage on it for the emphasis and the purpose of, again, example is Ghana. And prior to the COP in Durban in 2012, there was a huge push on the gender dimension of the climate struggle particularly in mining communities and in deforested areas in the middle belt of Ghana. And they were able to jump on other campaigns and not create a separate one, but create a parallel strand of the campaign and able to use that existing structures of, anti-mining movements and gender empowerment and so on and so forth to raise this new concern about climate change. And so that may be the scoping exercise. What is working? Where is there a small scope for authority and power and social structures that can be used, to sort of support and amplify? Then, of course, there is the external. And I think externally, there will definitely be lots of groups we can kind of recommend based on your particular context and scenarios. But I want to end by recognizing that it is a huge struggle for many people. And we don't gloss over the fact that people's well-being are often affected by this kind of fighting for rights. And I, on a sober note, we do acknowledge that that is a huge challenge, and solidarity to everyone that goes through that uncomfortable and necessary fight for what should be duly yours. And so thank you for bringing that up.
Merci, Dr. Emmanuel. J'espère que vous allez rester avec nous jusqu'au bout. Nous l'espérons.
Thank you very much, Dr. Emmanuel. I hope that you will stay with us until the end. But because we are running out of time, we might have to pass to the other presenters. The others who have questions, maybe we'll have to wait for the second presenter. I would like to now hand over the mic to Elise, who is going to introduce the next facilitator. Elise, over to you.
Muchas gracias, Frank, y buenos días y buenas tardes a todas y todos.
Thank you so much, Frank, and good morning to all of you. I am Elise Martinez from Mexico, Cooperación Voluntaria, that's HIC member. And without further ado, I will be introducing to you Abir. It is a pleasure for us to have her. She is a water environment engineer currently. She is the coordinator of Pigon from Palestine, and she is a woman activist in Palestine and in Alliance Environmental Justice Organizations in Palestine. Abir works closely with affected communities, the youth sector, and with local government councils in addressing the environmental problems faced by the Palestinian people. She is a researcher in different environmental topics, mainly in water and climate change. She is a trainer in different environmental subjects, among them wastewater and environmental issues. She's also an active member in many social and environmental networks at a local and international level. She will talk about the tools that the society operates in order to foster the fight. She has 10 minutes, and then we will have a general session for questions and answers. Thank you. Abir, you have the floor.
Thank you all. I would like to welcome you all. I'm very happy to be with you in this meeting and to talk about the methodologies and the tools that society uses in order to have further engagement in struggle so that we can achieve climate justice for all. When we talk about the struggles of communities in order to achieve climate justice, we are here talking about different methodologies and tools in order to achieve that for at the national level, or international. The first methodology that we can follow is the mobilization for change and to network with different stakeholders in order to reach our goal that we are working for. And another methodology is resistance to stop all violations that lead to climate change. Perhaps these are practices, wrong practices by companies, perhaps activities by big companies, strategies and policies that could be harming the environment. We need to stop, we need to resist, to stop such policies and practices. And the third methodology is the transform. We need to change methodologies, and we need to get to solutions that are good to cope with climate change. It can be a solution to problems, be them used to actually deal with the mistake. When we talk about the struggles of the societies, we need networking, and we need actually to mobilize so that we can provide for means that are environment friendly. We talk about networking in order to know more about the problems and to identify strengths and weaknesses for the problem, and to know who are our allies and to whom we should go and who should we address, and who are representing the target groups. With these methodologies and tools that we should use according to each issue, we choose to actually see what is suitable. We have to be very definite about the goal that we need to achieve, so that we can actually change and get to achieve our goals and objectives. Such tools and methodologies should be very clear. Environmental activists know how such networks should be actually made, how we can network with our allies, what should be done, how to build alliances across different scales. Also, the press is very important. Media is very important. We need to get their attention, and in order to get to make the change that we are looking for. There are some examples in different communities in the Arab region, also in the Middle East and North Africa. These are some community initiatives. We have here the Tunisian experience. There are some efforts by the communities towards eco-agriculture, and we are mobilizing towards real climate adaptation actions. For example, there are successes like the seed bank that can adapt to the climate change, and they are more resistant than other seeds. Also, we have some success stories when it comes to the technologies that are good to the communities. For example, for harvesting, for watering, distant watering, and to also protect the soil from erosion, and to be away from chemicals and fertilizers, chemical fertilizers. Also, when we work at the level of policies, we need eco-agriculture with no fertilizers and chemicals. Another challenge in another country, which is Egypt. Egypt is actually the first country, let me say, or the most affected by desertification, according to the researchers and according to the Executive Secretariat of the United Nations Convention to combat desertification. So Egypt ranks first in the world. In fact, Egypt is trying to face desertification and to decrease the salinity in the soil. They have a problem with drought. They are allying and they are networking in order to find applications to adapt to this problem and to face such challenge. Another experience is in Jordan, mobilization towards having a law and regulations to protect forests. In fact, our colleague Hala can actually talk about that and about such mobilizing and lobbying in Jordan in order to find laws and to implement the laws that can protect forests in Jordan. Also, we have some efforts that are being exerted in order to protect forests because of climate change. That is in Algeria. There were many fires, big ones with big damage in the forests in Algeria. Communities are mobilizing in order to find some methodologies to deal with it and to mitigate such damage. Another experience and another struggle, what happened recently in Libya. The floods that took place that damaged big areas with big and huge losses in lives just recently in Libya. And after that, unfortunately, there were a lot of efforts to deal quickly with such disasters, natural disasters, and how to deal with the floods. And according to studies, international studies, having such floods annually, if things remain the same, the possibility will be 20 to 50% possibility that it will happen annually. The CSOs, the civil society organizations are trying to find measures, mitigation measures, and to deal with such problems and disasters like floods. In Palestine, we find that we are trying to deal with floods that take place in certain areas. They are in the north of Palestine. We have our soil sometimes that does not absorb water. We need to wait until water evaporates, and this leads to a lot of damage to the harvest. There are some good examples and success stories, like in the picture that you can see below. There are like canals in order to collect the water and to use it in a better way. Perhaps we can store it underground and use it when necessary. Such a technique was a real good one and mitigated the damage of floods on agricultural lands. And we can use it also when there is no rain. Also, the youth. What about the youth and how they can make a difference in the climate sphere? This is a very important role. In fact, they are doing some major work. And in many countries, we'll find that there are youth who are trying to change national policies and to raise the voices. There are many efforts that are being exerted by the CSOs in order to raise awareness amongst the youth. The tools that they are using in mobilizing and lobbying are different. For example, after the youth summit, the climate youth summit, in many countries and before the international climate summit. We find that they do a lot of work in their own summit. They do a lot of lobbying. And we focus on the youth to raise awareness about such issues. We are now going to talk about another methodology, something to be environment friendly.
المناخية، التجربة المغربية الناجحة في زيادة اعتمادهم على مصادر الطاقة الجديدة وتحديدا
Moroccan experience using solar power and gradually abandoning the dependence on fossil fuel and therefore achieving sovereignty over fuel or energy. I would like to caution that when implementing such major clean energy projects, other issues should be taken into consideration, such as the use of land, in order for it not to be affected, not to be at the account of agricultural land. There should be regularizing of this sector to take the environmental criteria. Another experience in Palestine, which is moving towards new energy, taking gender into consideration and integrating gender into this change and into this transformative change to use clean energy in our dear Gaza. I hope that the war ends as soon as possible, and I hope that justice is achieved for all the people and our people in our beloved Gaza. We see in the pictures here Palestinian women who work as technical staff in adjusting solar cells. They have the skills and the knowledge of the technical issues to operate these clean energy stations. We also worked on raising or building the capacity of women to impact national policies, network with the decision makers, and raise the demands of women. So moving towards clean energy should also be just and take into consideration the needs of the communities, and the energy should be in the hands of the community and not be restricted to large corporations. When implementing clean energy projects, there should be justice for the community as well, and it should be suitable for the community and fulfill their needs to be suitable for the marginalized communities, and the energy should be in the hands of these communities rather than being restricted to large companies. Another methodology is resisting and stopping the polluters. Abir, you please summarize. Thank you. And resisting multinationals. Tomorrow or after tomorrow, this will start a special meeting on human rights in the United Nations to discuss an international obliging agreement for these multinationals, and our role comes here to influence this agreement in order to fulfill our needs and to oblige these multinationals who commit pollution. The COP in Dubai next month or the month after, influencing and obliging major countries to depend less on fossil fuel. In Dubai, the demand will be to reduce the dependence on fossil fuel. Being a country that produces this fuel, this is a success story using courts or the law to top polluting companies, which is Total company. The French law was used and a lawsuit was filed from Friends of Land in cooperation with Friends of the Land from Uganda and the influencers in Uganda to hold the petroleum companies accountable, the major companies accountable in Uganda and Tanzania, and they made a lot of success in 2017. The lobbying, pressure, and campaign tools, we need to depend on a number of tools, including press releases, interviews, films, producing media material, fact papers, position papers, and to know the tendency of the influencers. I would like to conclude saying that climate change threaten millions around the world, and it hurts the poor most, but the solutions are in our hands if we address issues quickly, fairly, and equitably to achieve change and to achieve climate justice for everyone. Thank you very much.
شكرا.
Thank you. Muchas gracias, Abir, por compartirnos esta diversidad de ejemplos que además combinan.
Thank you very much, Abir, for sharing all this plethora of examples that included actions of mobilization, reporting, and giving us examples of food sovereignty. We would also like to say on behalf of HIC members and HIC organizations that we stand beside you, because what you're going through, you need to keep on fighting the good fight so you can change the situation for the better. Thank you very much. I think we will give the floor directly to Astrid, and then we will have a Q&A session for all the speakers, just due to time constraints. So I'm going to introduce Astrid real quick. Astrid is Colombian, Latin American, Mexican as well. She's a lawyer with expertise in environmental law, human rights, and climate change, and the intersection of these. With a climate justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion perspective, she has worked for and with communities and indigenous peoples in Latin America, contributing to the protection of their rights and territory, including Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, and Peru. She has also been a consultant for the United Nations, Greenpeace International, and foundations. She collaborates with the Environmental Justice Clinic Berta Cáceres of the Universidad Iberoamericana. She received her law degree from the Universidad de los Andes in Bogota and holds a master's in comparative law from the University of Florida. She will talk today about a topic to highlight all the intersections that can be done regionally and interregionally. She will have some minutes for her presentation, and then we will have a collective Q&A session. Go ahead, Astrid. On the contrary, thank you for having me. This is a very important process to share some thoughts with you. And Manuel said I would only give you a glimpse on some of the priorities that I believe are important in these 10 minutes. I think to start off talking about climate justice and see how can we prioritize our actions, we need to understand the root cause of the climate crisis that we're facing. I believe that the first step, and I believe that this is an important event because many people working on the field understand that globally, we can understand the root causes for the climate crisis. Let me remind you that when we talk about a climate crisis, we talk about a civilizatory crisis. And I mean that by reducing a certain number of emissions of carbon and the reforestation of a certain number of hectares is just a measure. We're dealing with the patriarchy. We are dealing with nature and a subject of conquest, with an unlimited extractivism that intersects with systems of discrimination and systematic exclusion. We also need to start off talking about reality. We need to know where we're standing right now in order to determine the false solutions that are receiving a lot of echo right now and transforming into really profound solutions. That's something that Abir mentioned in several occasions. How we can have a feminine approach on care. So, to start off my presentation, I want to remind you how this crisis started. We need to understand that climate change is affecting every corner of the world at different levels, and this is scientifically proven. When I'm talking about science, I also think that we need to consider the Western science, something that the CCP has done. But we also need to consider traditional or ancient science, because this goes beyond realities. Even the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change of the UN, after many years has recognized that human activities are the root cause for the changes that we have seen so far in this planet. As previously mentioned, we still see that despite the billions of dollars invested and the plethora of efforts made by people, in my case, ever since I started working on this field, I still see an increase in the greenhouse emissions, and this makes me think what we need to do differently. Now, based on reality, today, as spoken by Emmanuel and Abir, the NDCs lead us to a fatal scenario of a global warming above 3 degrees. So we need to have different actions in order for us to reach the maximum limit as determined by the Western science. This is 1.5 degrees. We need to remind ourselves who is responsible for this. We need to talk about governments, states, private stakeholders, such as companies, the financial sector, the agricultural industry, but also people, because climate change is a direct result of excessive consumption. I included the 20 countries with the higher emissions causing climate change, so we can see what our priorities are and what they should be. This is a list that was created by an NGO that has documented the biggest companies, the biggest emitters in history, starting on the 1800s. Many of these corporations are both private and public. They are located in the Arab region, but also Latin America, such as Petrobras in Brazil and Pemex in Mexico. When we talk about climate injustice, we talk about inequality. And let me remind you that 10% of the world population is responsible for 50% of the emissions. This is important when defining priorities. And 8 out of the 10 most dangerous countries are located in Latin America, and this is a shame on us. We cannot see climate change separate from the numbers of violence and poverty that we've seen. Let's talk about the false solutions that we need to tackle. What I mean by fostering profound solutions that include a feminine approach from the South, and by feminine, I mean not only women, but also the feminine approach of having an awareness and a connection with nature. And I believe that this is more often than not taken for granted, and we need to take it back and embrace it. The traditional knowledge of the global South of many communities and indigenous communities have a knowledge that we can salvage. We also need to make a priority competition. More often than not, when talk about climate justice and climate change, we say win the war, but we don't need to win a war. We need to find peace and find spaces for collaboration and salvage all those ancestral knowledges that are often referred to as ignorant magic or knowledge, but there is an essential magic and knowledge to promote the solutions that we need. Climate justice talks about equality. This is essential. I also want to say that we need to use all the legal tools available, both nationally and internationally. Last year, we finally made happen the recognition of the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. None of the states present in the UN Assembly voted against it. So this is really important for us to make it applicable in reality. We talk about principles of human rights such as universality, indivisibility, interdependence, non-discrimination, and non-aggressiveness. I know it's easier said than done, but just like Abir and Emmanuel said, there is a plethora of solutions that can actually help us protect human rights. This is a list of all the most affected rights. Just to wrap up, I would like to remind you that we have a list of specific obligations applicable to states that are legally binding both internationally at UN level and locally at many states. The states are responsible for respecting, protecting, preventing, and ensuring the protection of human rights. Another essential obligation is regulating, overseeing, and controlling activities that could potentially cause environmental damages. I believe that in Latin America, a big gift given by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights was the interpretation of extraterritoriality. And by this, I mean that there are damages that go beyond borders of states, and states can be held internationally liable for those violations against human rights as long as there is a specific control of those decisions. That decision was also welcomed by the Children's Rights Committee of the UN during a trial against 5 states. At the end of the day, one of the priorities is reminding ourselves of that feminine approach of stop competing among ourselves and start collaborating with each other. I know it's difficult, but we are on the way. We also need to remember that there are many international national accords and treaties for us to implement all the decisions and make that change happen. Thank you very much, Astrid. What you shared with us is really interesting because it provides us with many tools for us to continue working. You're giving us legal resources and tools that we should be aware of to access all these potential avenues. I know there will be people that are just waiting for the Q&A session to raise their hands. I see there's a lot of activity going on in the chat box. And this is the time when we can share common experiences and strategies that can be useful in our regions. This is an open space, so feel free to raise your hand, and please be mindful of other speakers. Sammy, go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum.
Peace be upon you. Do you hear me? Of course, I'm Sami Najar from Yemen, all youth organization or foundation. I listened to Manuel and Abir, and I liked very much what they said, the strategies that may be encouraging for many people to work on climate change. However, in the regions where there are wars, there is a difficulty because there are many changes in the climate, and the foremost reason for these changes is the explosive material, in addition to the landmines, the absence of policies, and more than that, the absence of security to implement any activity that may be ensured to implement with the authorities, because there are no real authorities for the local organizations to deal with or to cooperate with. I hope that there are clear strategies to work in places with severe conflicts, or the countries with the most potential of facing unnatural disasters, maybe because of wars. All the strategies that were placed were strategies that can be implemented in safe countries, but cannot be implemented in unsafe countries. So I hope that there is more clarification on part of the two speakers. We will benefit from the experience of everyone present. Thank you very much.
أدريانا أريل ترفع يدها.
I
تفضلي.
see Areli has raised her hand. Go ahead, Areli.
Muchas gracias, Hala.
Thank you very much, Hala. My comment is really brief, and I have a question for Abir and Astrid. My comment revolves around what we are currently discussing. To what extent state commitments are applicable to the climate crisis? I will use Mexico as an example. In Genera, an ally organization of HIC recently analyzed the budget for climate change. And that report says that despite the fact that Mexico has increased its budget allocation on climate change over 183%, it turns out that this increase in resources do not go to actions that are directly related to climate change. They are allocating budget to priority budgets, such as a train that has devastated the southeast area of our country, and also Sembrando Vida, a program that has also been devastating. There might be other examples in other countries. Governments often say that they are doing something about it, but in reality, what are we supporting through those national budgets? And we see that we are far from complying with our climate commitments. So my question for Abir and Astrid is, what would you recommend, based on your fighting experience, to organizations and alliances to unmask these false solutions? Because Astrid said there are many false solutions to climate change. It's very difficult to understand this at a community level. Sometimes not even us understand the budgetary scaffolding at a technical level. But unmasking government is a pressing issue. So whatever recommendation, suggestion, tip, or point that you could give us would be much appreciated. Thank you. Well, Abir, Astrid, anyone would like to answer Areli's question? Thank you, Abir. Go ahead.
شكرا.
Thank you. With relation to the intervention of Mr. Sami from Yemen, I agree with you that wars are a major source of emissions, and they are the determinant of the implementation of a number of measures to adapt with climate change. There is an international agreement dealing with weapons. You can resort to it and work through campaigns on the level of the country and use these agreements to hold accountable those who perpetuate these wars or the use of such weapons, and to push these parties to commit to the agreements, and then impose sanctions when there is a violation. Also to use some research to prove the impact of such wars on climate change, and to be a tool for lobbying, for advocacy, submit them to a number of forums, international forums, to demonstrate the violations to human rights that these practices commit. With relation to the question that our colleague posed earlier, with relation to government commitments to measures to adapt to climate change, we need to go back and review these government commitments to assess them if they are in line with the situation of every state. For example, also to make sure that these commitments are real, are in line with the measures, the correct measures, or the correct solutions for adapting with climate change, because there are many commitments that governments perform that are not the right ones and are among the false solutions for climate change adaptation. So as a civil society, we have to review these international commitments and to demand the allocation of greater budgets in this area on the national level as well as on the international level. There are a number of community movements that demand their governments to give the environmental sector, particularly the climate sector, to allow them, to empower them to do to perform these measures in a better way.
Gracias. Para complementar, gracias a Verdi, perdón, a
Thank
Beer,
you,
por la
Abir,
respuesta. Creo que
for your answer. For Mexico, one of the biggest challenges that we have is that Mexico, at least internationally, has been a climate champion since 2010 until 2018, when this new administration took office, when many initiatives have been dismantled. One of the things that were mentioned by Abir included mobilization and partnership among different movements. I believe this is important. And some people previously said that due to the context, mobilization and reporting is not possible, but that's something that we need to continue doing. In Brazil, under the Bolsonaro administration, we also had other information sources, and that calls for our creativity and resourcefulness as movements. Emmanuel talked about the elephants in the room. And one of the elephants in the room is that social movements often work from their own silo, all scattered and separated. In Mexico, as well as many other countries, we need to join forces so we can make our voice heard louder. Particularly for Mexico, we need to talk about how these so-called priority projects affect the most vulnerable people in the country. One of the concerns is that one of the projects, such as Sembrando Vida, has been exported to the Northern Triangle. This is critical because it will increase deforestation. Mexico has also promised to Guatemala and other countries to strengthen the oil and gas industry. We need to fight inequality among movements. One of the questions asked for Emmanuel, and I'm circling back to a topic I talked about before, is tackling these inequalities and open up these spaces for those people that have been affected the most by these impacts. And sometimes they have the solution to every problem. The floor is always used by people that are often the same people that we've seen so far, but we need to give voice to other people that may give us some more useful solutions. We also need to start a strategic litigation. For climate, I believe that organizations should be at the core of everything because litigations are always started by privileged people in the North. These are some of the ideas that I believe that are important to ponder. We also need to think about those people funding these projects in Mexico and other countries, and those people that should be held accountable should be provided with this information. Thank you very much. Thank you, Astrid. You're giving us a wide array of ideas for us to move forward. One question, those people that raised their hand during Emmanuel's intervention, are you still interested in asking a question or using the floor? Well, Dibin asked for the floor. Dibin, are you there? Please raise your hand because I wouldn't be able to see you otherwise. Dibin? You don't want to use the floor anymore? Ana Pastor also wanted to ask a question. I don't know if she's still around. Enrique Frota, go ahead. And after Enrique, we'll have Desmond. Thank you, Ellis. While our colleagues decide whether they want to use the floor or not, I just want to take this opportunity to thank Abir and Astrid for their intervention. I was thinking about the potential similarities between the regional contexts that were recently presented. In my opinion, something that is important for HIC is the right to land and to housing, as well as the impact suffered by people caused by climate change. This is closely related to the vulnerabilities and negative effects on their human rights and housing rights. More often than not, these communities are the safekeepers of these resources available in their communities, such as soil and water. So I would like to hear a little bit about how you see the connection between the climate crisis and the different systems that violate the human rights of these impacted communities. Because I think the climate crisis will not be solved unless the land appropriation systems are changed. Because private groups are often the powerful ones that take over lands, but also local communities are at the core of the conversation. That is my opinion, but I would like to hear what you have to say about that. Thank you very much for your question, Enrique, because this is a powerful question for the collective reflection towards finding strategies that we would like to see surfacing in these co-learning spaces. That would be an open question for everyone. In the meantime, we will give the floor to Desmond.
Thank you very much, Elise, and all the presenters. I really, it was informative, highly informative. But I had a question which I wanted to ask Emmanuel, and because of time, thank God that I have an opportunity now to ask, because Dr. Emmanuel, in your presentation, you also recognize and agree the difficulties in accessing funds for climate change activities, and considering the fact that the vulnerable group and those communities, the organizations working at the local level lack capacity, and it's really difficult in terms of accessing funds and carrying out activities, whether in terms of adaptation or in different ways. Yes, as we know that climate justice, we looked at the issue of fairness and equity, but then it becomes very difficult for community-based organizations and even civil society organizations that are at the higher level to access funds in implementing climate change-related activities. In your own experience over the years and looking at the process, what do you think is the best way to go about this? Because for me, as a teacher, we have not seen the way out of going about this issue in terms of breaking the barriers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Desmond. I think, yeah, you are right that the barriers to finance, and that has been going on quite a while. Sorry, I'm moving. Let me move. It's a challenge that has been going on for quite a while. But I'd like to say on that note that the modalities, funding modalities for climate action, be it the adaptation fund, be it the Green Climate Fund, be it the Green Technology and Advancement Fund, and etc., they've all begun to change. So the modalities for climate finance are beginning to recognize new pathways for subnational accreditation. So almost all these large climate financing instruments were designed for state access, where the Ministry of Environment or the state ministry responsible will be the main pathway in partnership with the Ministry of Finance, etc. But almost all of them now have revised the modalities. So my point is that we are on a threshold of change where, because of increased advocacy, almost every major funder is beginning to recognize that you need NGOs. And so I would like to just say that the landscape is changing and opportunities are changing, so begin to recognize. The second practical thing is the accreditation itself. And there are ways in which NGOs and CBOs can bypass bottlenecks by using proxies. One of the biggest proxies is the UNDP in many developing countries. And so a lot of NGOs go into partnership or respond to calls that are launched by UNDPs. The other thing I would like to say is, like with any other funding opportunity, it's like a mine. You need to search for it. And I think that a lot of NGOs don't invest as much time in proposal writing and develop that skill. They are fantastic at delivery. And unfortunately, if we don't look at the full range of skill sets that we need, we cut ourselves out of that. So I will encourage every NGO representative here to invest in some skill sets on proposal writing, on searching for proposals and programs and opportunities, etc. Because there are some calls that come that we miss out because we are not aware, because we are not looking, or because we are not prepared enough. The other thing I would also like to encourage, and from experience, is that often we think that we need the $1 million before we can deliver action. Or often we think that until we get $500,000, we are not able to do work. I would like to mention that it will be important to also develop different scales of programs and intervention that fit different scales of budgets, so that you are not caught out when it comes to the track record criteria or looking out for your previous track record and action. And also that will push you to be able to think about how we can do much with little. And I think a lot of NGOs do a lot with little, and we need to continue in that that spirit of developing programs and doing a lot with little. There is a growth in push for domestic financing and the role of private sector financing. And I know that it's a bit of a challenge in Africa and many parts of the world, but there is some opportunity that actually some private sector actors are willing to give something as part of CSO, corporate social responsibilities, etc., to NGOs to do something about climate change. I think that this is the time where the agenda has matured enough that we can try and jump on some of these things. So I hope this is just the beginning of the conversation anyway. I don't want to take up all the time because I could go on and on and on with ideas that come to mind and how you are able to navigate this roadblock. But the landscape is changing and access is coming. And I think you need to get yourself ready so that you jump onto the bandwagon even quicker than others. Yeah.
شكرا إيمانويل. أعتقد أننا يعني
Thank you, Emmanuel. I believe we heard all of your talk, and especially when it comes to working on the ground. Thank you very much. 2 points very quickly. Number one, Estrid in her talk talked about the projects that are being financed and implemented are in a way or another come under the umbrella that we work for the climate and for the green spaces. But today, if we want to do anything, or if we wanted to pass, if whether it is violating or not violating rights, we just put the word sustainable and the word green, and then we make it pass. So as if the green is our path. But for me, this is actually a matter that makes me doubt. When I see the word green, I get the feeling that we have to be aware of what is really going on. If it is big projects coming from the World Bank even, or the big financing funds, if you want to really do the work, if you want to continue to work, like Enrique said, there are others who are actually violating our rights in land and houses. We have to be aware that all of this is not going to happen unless we have a line to go and to follow that has something to do with accountability and collection of information. We can do that if we don't collect the information in the way we want. We can do that by by the help of some of the companies and with coordination and in coordination with communities. Another point, well, some of the organizations had titles for their meetings, sustainable environmental topics and green topics. These were big titles. But when you come to the real work, you find that we as local communities, we cannot really do the work, and no one is held accountable. Another point, the solution is to empower on the ground, do empower the communities. We can't talk about justice. And up till now, there are people whose rights are being violated in the field of environment or land or housing. We have to make principles. We have to create some rules. How can we work sustainably on the ground? How to do some real work that is clear towards climate justice. People have their information, basic information, and we can use that. We can use such knowledge. We use them as tools in order to make some successes on the ground. Those are the people we really need to work with and for. Astrid mentioned something about that, but I just want to say that we have different paths, but one of them is financing. We have to control such financing, especially the money that we get in the south. Usually the money comes in the form of loans, and this is a big disaster. Another thing is local communities is a treasure of knowledge. Astrid, please go ahead.
Thank you very much.
شكرا
Thank you, Hala,
جزيلا
for
لك يا
bringing this
هالة.
up. We know that the answers
شكرا.
are more
عفوا لا
profound
يوجد
than
عفوا ترجمة. عفوا لا توجد ترجمة إلى اللغة الإنجليزية
Can you hear me in the
لكلامها.
English channel?
عليك أن تعيدي. Okay,
You need to
please
repeat because
do
we don't
repeat.
hear the Arabic translation. So please interrupt me if there is a problem. Hala, can you hear me? Hala, you were saying how important it was to protect communities. And we need to protect the community's agencies. We know that the most vulnerable people are not only victims, but we are the protagonists of change. As Enrique said, land protection is really important. I just want to remind you that the climate crisis is a symptom of a deep disease suffered by the planet, where consumerism with capitalism has led us down this spiral. As you know, there are many scientific pieces of evidence showing that the protection of ecosystems, forests, and different rainforests are best protected by communities, because there's a series of indigenous or Afro-descending communities protecting those places. So circling back to the collective is important because we know that part is under fire. I would like to circle back to what Emmanuel said. We still need to identify many solutions that are ongoing. We saw it during COVID, and what protected us during COVID were our local networks. I would like to bring that up because we need to stop doing the same things we've done so far, because the solutions will not come from the big projects or the big corporations, because they made us be where we are today, and we need to find different solutions. Thank you to all the people that have spoken so far. I think we've had more clarity and more pointers to create our strategies. I would like to give the floor to my colleague Diana so we can wrap up our session.
Thank you. Thank you very much, dear Elise. A big thank you to our speakers. I want to really appreciate Emmanuel, Abir, and Astrid for the amazing presentations, and of course, to the participants for the lovely comments and feedback that you gave. I really want to conclude in the next few minutes. So if you could just allow me to quickly share my screen, and in particular, the key activities coming up. The first thing is, as usual, we want to hear from you. Help us improve the sessions. Your contributions to this evaluation form has helped us over the weeks. So once again, we'll invite you to answer the evaluation forms in the different languages. We will also share this on email. The other thing is session 4 will be very exciting. We are really concluding the 4th co-learning space. It's the end of the conversation. It's the springboard to take us to another level of conversation as HIC members. So please do not miss the 4th session next week. Remember, it's the same time. We have conversations that will be led by Patricia Watimena from ESRNet, Hala Barakat, our dear HIC member and friend, and of course, our dear President, Adriana Allen, who will put everything together. So please register for this session and make sure you're there. And also for the 4th session, we also want to hear from you. Remember, we have the Google Classroom where we have conversations in between the meetings. We have 2 questions for you. Number 1, what is your ask or demand of the HIC Climate Justice Advocacy Strategy? What should it have? What should it not miss? Of course, these are things we have talked about already in the session today, but please share your thoughts. Another thing is, what is your demand from COP28? 2 key questions that we'd really want to hear from you. And remember, in the email that we send out, we have the link to Google Classroom. And of course, we are always very happy to hear from you and see your contributions. We are concluding in the next 2 minutes, and I want to again reiterate that we are really with our colleagues, our brothers and sisters in Gaza, in Palestine at the moment. And we just want to share the spirit of solidarity in this struggle and in this moment. We are really joining the rest of the world to stop, to call on to stop the ongoing violence, and to also denounce the complicity of the silence of the West. And just to remind you that we are together and that we are sending you our strength and our love, and we shall overcome. Thank you and particularly also to appreciate Abir for being with us despite the situation, and for really making the time to be with us today. We have 1 minute left, and I'm not seeing any hands from my team. So I will just call us to do what we usually do. We smile very hard, and we take our usual photo. This is like our school photo for the day. So bring out those amazing smiles. Don't be shy. Smile very broadly at the laptop and hold that smile for 2 seconds. Hold it, don't let it drop. 1 last second of the smile. Thank you very much. You look lovely. You look amazing. And thank you. And I'm glad that you also enjoyed this session and that we'll see each other next week. Please don't miss. It's going to be very, very exciting. And we'll also share news about the upcoming co-learning spaces in November. Thank you and goodbye. Have a good evening, good morning, good afternoon. Thank you so much. Watch out for the emails that will send all the information.
Emmanuel, shukran Esther.
Thank you so much to our speakers, of course. Astrid, thank you so much. Thank you, Emmanuel. Thank you, dear Abir, our facilitators. Good job. Elise, Frank, wonderful moderation, and our dear timekeeper, Laura. Amazing. Goodbye. Goodbye, everyone.
Por favor, terminen las grabaciones. Quienes estamos grabando, concluir la grabación. Stop recording.